Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this Dispatch from the Front. The culture wars continue to rage across the United States of America today. I want to take a look at one company who's chosen to respond to the situation, as so many have, with a statement. These statements tend to be kind of restatements of principles or values, and so they're worth taking a look at in the context of this podcast. But I want to pick it apart a little bit and see what it says about the wider values involved here. All right. This article is from the Detroit Free Press. GM's Mary Barra pens letter to workers amid George Floyd protest. This is a story by Jamie L. LaRoe. As protests against racism and police brutality erupted through Detroit, Minneapolis, Grand Rapids, and other cities Saturday, General Motors CEO Mary Barra took pen to paper. She set a lofty goal that day to start an advisory board with the intention of making GM the most inclusive company she can. Around 9 p.m., she'd uploaded her writings to GM's internal communication system for all the automaker's 180,000 worldwide employees to see. It would leave no doubt as to her intentions or feelings. The recent death of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor astonishingly add to the important and unconscionable list of Black Americans who have lost their lives based on the color of their skin. I am both impatient and disgusted by the fact that we as a nation, we seem to be placated by the passive discussion of why. Why does this happen? Why can't we get to a different place? Why is the response so visceral? On May 25th, and this is breaking from the letter, on May 25th, Floyd, an African-American, died in Minneapolis after a police officer kneeled for several minutes on his neck. The officer has been charged with murder. Arbery, also African-American, was shot to death on February 23rd as he was jogging through a neighborhood in Brunswick, Georgia. His death sparked outrage amid belief that it was racially motivated. On March 13th, police in Louisville, Kentucky, used a battering ram to enter the apartment of Taylor, an African-American emergency room technician. They were executing a search warrant, and after a brief confrontation, they fired several shots, killing her. Barra said she will commission and chair an inclusion advisory board made up of internal and external leaders, effective by the end of the quarter. Its goal is to inspire GM to be the most inclusive company in the world. GM already has a track record for diversity and inclusion. In May, it and Toyota Motor North America each made the 2020 Diversity Inc. Top 50 list, the only two car companies recognized out of 1,800. Toyota surged to number 10 from number 18. GM ranked number 30. In October 2018, the Global Report on Gender Equality ranked GM number 1 in the world for gender equality in the workplace. GM had lots of other firsts in terms of diversity. I'm not going to read the whole list here. In 1968, it was had the first minority supplier program in the auto industry, so it's got a long history here. In 2018, first auto company to have a female CEO and CFO, for what that's worth. In the current environment, Barra urged employees to consider what they can do to invoke change. In this moment, we must decide what we can do individually and collectively to drive change, meaningful, deliberate change. As one of the largest global companies, there is much we can do. She listed GM's values as, we commit to inclusion. That means creating the conditions where every single human who believes in inclusion is welcome within our walls. We unequivocally condemn intolerance. That means racism, bigotry, discrimination, and any other form of named or unnamed hatred. We stand up against injustice. That means taking the risk of expressing an unpopular or polarizing point of view, because complacency and complicity sit in the shadow of silence. She added, Barr said her post is more pointed than many of the other topics I've shared. However, in this moment, there is no place for ambiguity. She added, my personal commitment is to ensure that the leadership of GM, and by extension the entire GM family, consistently remains aware of our responsibility to bring awareness to injustice, because awareness leads to dialogue, dialogue leads to understanding, and understanding leads to change. Okay, that's great. I would challenge Mary Barra that if someone within GM is engaging in discrimination, is engaging in hate, bigotry or whatever, that she go ahead and dig them out and fire them. because that is the scope of GM as a company. I don't know who Mary Barra thinks she was elected by, but when you make political statements that go beyond the scope of your company, you're doing your company an ill service. And the reason I say that is simply this. Mary Barra was weighing in on this before the facts were clear in these cases. Not one of the three has been to trial. During the trial process, you have a little phenomenon known as discovery, where you try to ascertain the motives of the people who have been accused. In order to convict, you're supposed to have motive, means, and opportunity. Motive meaning you had some reason for doing what you did. Means you could do what you did. And opportunity was you had a chance to do what you did. So the astonishing thing about these cases is it's not yet clear, if it's true at all, that these three people, and I think Breonna Taylor probably has the largest chance of this being true, but for Floyd, Arbery, and Taylor, that these three people were killed because of the color of her skin. Mary Barra states that as a fact, saying that they add to the unimportant and unconscionable list of Black Americans who have lost their lives based on the color of their skin. And yet that's not been established yet. We don't have any evidence that that's the case. In fact, they finally released the pictures of the 4 police officers, did you know there were 4? Who were kneeling on George Floyd. And it looks like a United Colors of Benetton ad. One of the officers is an Asian man. He was identified as a Hmong, Southeast Asian. Another one was a black man. So when you see that, you have to think, well, how is it possible that they allowed a white man to murder a black man a foot away from them? That really doesn't make a lot of sense. Unless, as I pointed out since the beginning, the conflict is not between white and black. The issue here is between an authoritarian approach to policing and the citizenry. We also have to consider the actions of the decedents here in the run-up to their death count for something, and those have not been fully established yet. It is a different story if someone is reaching for a weapon and they get shot by a police officer. It may be regrettable, it may be a misunderstanding, but it's understandable to some extent that a police officer might respond for fear of their life in such a situation. That has not yet been firmly determined. And it's tricky because, of course, the police have a history of claiming this even when it is not in evidence. And since they tend to be the last witness, it's awfully hard to say that that's a true representation of the facts on the ground. So we want to be cautious here. We're not saying that's not the case. We're simply saying that it hasn't been proven, and a CEO of a company like GM really ought to know better than to start making up their own facts. It's disgraceful. And it's unnecessary. If you want to form within GM a stronger framework for inclusiveness and diversity, well, that's firmly within her power to do so. She doesn't even need a reason outside of GM to do anything of the sort. She can simply do it. So why go out on a limb when facts may well undermine your reasoning later? And so what happens when we get this council up and running and it starts its work, and then it comes out that one or more of these cases was not due to the color of the victim's skin? Won't that undermine the initiative? At least in the eyes of GM employees? I think it will. You have to be careful about your facts. And I don't think she was particularly careful there. I think she was moved. And you can see feelings language here. I am both impatient and disgusted by the fact that as a nation, well, that's great. And I'm sure many other GM employees are impatient and disgusted, but your job as leader is to set the culture. And that's not determined by your impatience or disgust. Who wants to follow a leader based on their impatience or disgust? That's a recipe to go straight over a cliff as an organization. So, you may feel the need to signal your impatience and disgust, but when you're using it as a justification for a decision that you're making, well, that's just ill-considered. But let's talk about the values themselves here. So like we said, GM has a long history. I don't know why it took them till 2018 to have a female CEO and a female CFO. Given that long history, I don't know why the CEO and CFO is that important. Do we necessarily view it that until GM has an entire leadership team that's female, it doesn't count? Does GM as a company, all 180,000 employees, need to be all female before it counts? I don't know. But needless to say, GM has made strong inroads in both gender and in race to be inclusive. But let's see what they say about inclusion. We commit to inclusion. That means creating the conditions where every single human who believes in inclusion is welcome within our walls. Simple problem with this statement. You never defined inclusion. What exactly does that mean? And I'll tell you that that's not uncommon, because some people who want to rally behind inclusion do not really mean inclusion. You or I, when we take a look at something like inclusion, we say, oh, that's a good thing. It means you listen to people. It means you do not exclude people based on criteria that are irrelevant to the job. Right? The whole point is, why should I disregard what someone is telling me because they are a woman, because they are of a different race, because of their sexual orientation, what have you? Those things are all irrelevant, except I suppose they could be relevant in certain very specific companies and jobs. Maybe that counts. But for the vast majority, and certainly for GM, those things are irrelevant. So you or I reading inclusion would have in mind bringing more brains and more ideas to the table. In fact, I think when you or I think about diversity, that's what we think of. Not diversity in the shallow, tribal sense of it, wherein we are redheads, and therefore, we need to make sure there is a redhead on every committee in the company. But diversity in the sense that we should have a wide range of thoughts and experience and opinions. And to the extent the redhead opinion or thoughts or what have you is unique, great. We should make sure that we have a good representation of that kind of thinking. That makes us better. It helps us attack problems from more angles than if we simply had a monoculture wherein groupthink was prevalent. Groupthink being where everybody just toes to the party line. And here is where you run into the problem with people not defining inclusion. Because what they're talking about much of the time when they have ambiguous notions of inclusion is not including everybody, it's excluding people they don't like. And it makes me think when they say every single human who believes in inclusion is welcome. Well, step back from it. They are an auto manufacturer. What the hell does making cars have to do with a philosophy of inclusion? Is it a good thing to have many ideas at the table? Of course it is. But in making cars, what exactly, why is having someone who thinks, quote, the right way more important than having someone who knows how to make a car? Your family is going to ride in those cars. Do you want the person working on the airbag system to be someone who knows how to install an airbag system, or somebody who attends the right committee meetings and thinks, quote, the right way about political matters? Give me the person who knows. I don't care what their beliefs are. You can give me the most ardent socialist. You could give me the most committed Islamist. You could give me the most heartfelt Christian. You could give me, it doesn't really matter. I want the guy or the gal who puts in the best airbag, because my family rides on that. So I think what we're seeing in the way this value is formulated at GM is it's used as a weapon against the notion of meritocracy. Meritocracy simply means, hey, whoever the best person is for the job, give it to them. I thought that the whole point of diversity and inclusion was to ensure that true meritocracy exists. In other words, we had reason to suspect, based on the past history at a number of these companies, that while they claimed to be a meritocracy, that you kept seeing the exact same people showing up at the top. And I don't know about you, but in a big company with far-flung operations with a lot of different skills required, I find it hard to believe that the person running IT has the exact same background as the person running finance, as the person running operations. It just strikes me odd. Why would that be? If you were really looking for the best talent in each of those organizations. And the answer is you're not. Whoever was picking them was picking people that look like them, undoubtedly. And so I would say that if the problem that diversity and inclusion was created to solve was that companies had people picking people for opportunities for the wrong reasons, because they looked and acted like them rather than they were the best person for the job, that you don't fix that problem by simply switching whatever attribute that person at the top has. What good does it do you to go from having a male CEO who will only hire males for his leadership team and replace him with a female CEO who will only hire females? It does you no good at all. As a matter of fact, it undermines the whole notion of diversity and inclusion. We're supposed to be blind to these things and simply select the best people. Because who can complain if the best person for the job gets the job? The best person for the job got the job. That doesn't seem to be Mary Barra's focus, however. We unequivocally condemn intolerance. That means racism, bigotry, discrimination, and any other form of named or unnamed hatred. Now, I don't know what unnamed hatred even means. For that matter, I don't know what named hatred means. So we say racism, bigotry, discrimination. Okay, those are all good things. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission would certainly support that, EEOC. Yes, we should not have bigotry, racism, discrimination in the workplace. Absolutely not. Again, the focus of the workplace is to get the work done. That has nothing to do with, who your parents were. In any other form of named or unnamed hatred. Okay, Mary, you're in Detroit. A large number of your people are in Detroit. People in Detroit hate the Dallas Cowboys. Acceptable or unacceptable? They make a piñata out of Dak Prescott's Cowboys uniform. Dak Prescott happens to be the quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys. They have a big celebration before a big game where they whack the piñata. Is that a problem for you? I can't tell because you've created this intolerance anti-value, which is not very well defined. That's a problem. We stand up against injustice. That means taking the risk of expressing an unpopular or polarizing point of view because complacency and complicity sit in the shadow of silence. Okay, if someone does not believe in your loose definition of inclusion, are they allowed to stand up against it? For the terms of value 1 here, you say, every single human who believes in inclusion is welcome within our walls. It implies that anyone who doesn't is not. So I would assume that means no. And yet if they're standing up to injustice as they see it, say by the tendency of leadership to put in place people in positions for reasons other than experience and aptitude and leadership, I guess they're not allowed to speak up to power, are they? This is the problem with defining cultures based on feelings and not based on the purpose of the organization and those attributes which will best suit achieving that purpose. Look, when it comes to making cars, there is a good reason why you want to have a value around diversity or inclusion. And that's because you need to have, it's a far-ranging enterprise. There's lots of people involved, all up and down the supply chain, right? No one person builds a car. It takes thousands upon thousands of people to do their best. You have a wide labor pool. You need to make sure that you are bringing not only the best talent you can find to do that, but you need to make sure that you listen to them. And so it doesn't do you much good to have a managerial class within GM, which is clubby and does not listen to the people on the floor. But that's not what she's talking about. That's the problem. Maybe what GM ought to do is do like what companies like UPS have done. It's that you have to have floor experience before you can get these positions. You have to spend a couple of years in your career making cars before we're going to let you run a division that makes cars. And I think that would do wonders for true diversity and inclusion, as well as bridge a yawning gulf between a managerial class and the people who actually make the products at GM. Not least of which is it might encourage, I don't know what Mary Barra did earlier in her career, but I suspect, given at a time of pandemic when GM is under extreme pressure because car sales are so far down, we've talked in the past about the impacts that the rental car company problems have had on car manufacturers, for example. She's worried about her feelings about current events. I'll tell you, if I were a GM shareholder, I don't believe I am. I don't really keep that close an eye on it. But if I were a GM shareholder, I would want her to keep an eye on GM. And it's fine if you want to, put out statements and do so in your personal capacity as Mary Barra. But as CEO of GM, if your primary focus is on something that's not happening within your four walls, you've taken your eye off of what you're getting paid to do. Moreover, if you're using external events, using the deaths of 3 people to justify a policy that you were trying to put in but couldn't get put in for whatever reason, then you got another problem. But I don't think it helps anybody except people up to no good to go forth and place as preeminent values which are so ill-defined. How do you enforce behaviors associated with such values? And the only answer you can have is arbitrarily. That's what I think we're going to see at GM in the coming months. So they'll use this current crisis to push this through. I think it will be an absolute disaster because it hasn't been thought out. Unfortunately, I think the likeliest outcome of that disaster in implementation is going to be the discrediting of the actual pursuit of true diversity and inclusion, which is a shame because I think GM and so many other companies need it. All these companies, when they start to pyramid up to the top, they have a tendency to get super clubby. And it becomes all but impossible for an outsider to break in. No matter how experienced, no matter how successful, no matter how much the times call for it, you'll see the exact same people going to the exact same clubs at the top. I'll tell you, I worked for a company a number of years ago. And on my first day on the job, I was asked a question about where I was looking for a house. And when I told them where I was looking for a house, I kid you not, the room went cold. Because where I was looking for a house wasn't where the approved people went looking for a house. Fact was, I had small children. We needed a little more space. Needed the home to be affordable for that extra space. So I wasn't going to live in a small condo where these folks apparently wanted me to live. But they took that as a signal. The signal was, you are not one of us. And from that day forward, I kid you not, day one, they acted accordingly. That was the unwritten rule of the leadership culture there. Was you act like we do. And if you don't, you will be excluded. Now, it didn't matter that there was no, at least I could tell, there was no racial component to that. There may have been a gender component to it. I don't know. But it was interesting that red line was allowed to exist and supported and nurtured like a viper to the chest by that culture. And it made me think, how many people coming in to that culture from outside failed, not because they didn't have the skills, not because they didn't have the will, not because they did anything wrong, but simply because they didn't fit into the club. And how many millions of dollars have been lost along the years because they insist on that club above all? Diversity and inclusion done right can help us break up those clubs and finally unleash the full human capital of these companies. 180,000 people at GM. I guarantee you GM has 1,000 people who are absolute geniuses at what they do. At least. 180,000 people. And I bet that 1,000, almost none will get anywhere near Mary Barra's seat. Because they are not in the club. That's what we ought to be tearing down. That's what we ought to be attacking with inclusion. And I bet that if we approach it that way, we will find that once the club is gone, that, what a surprise, we'll find that the gender representation is better, the race representation is better, and more importantly, that the teams are more functional because there's not this unwritten set of rules excluding people from doing their jobs. Because at the end of the day, virtue signaling is one thing, but culture is everything. Thank you.